Every single day, billions of people around the world interact with one of the most recognizable symbols of American power. It's not the flag, it's not the Constitution, it's a thin rectangle of green and white paper that fits neatly inside a wallet, the United States dollar bill. You pull it out without thinking. You hand it over at a register. You leave it as a tip. You fold it into a birthday card. It feels permanent. It feels like it's always been there, like the dollar bill has existed as long as America itself. But here's the thing, it hasn't. The modern dollar bill, the small green standardized note that you carry today, did not exist until 1929. That's right. For over 150 years, after America declared independence, there was no dollar bill as you know it. And before that, the story of what Americans actually used as money is so chaotic, so bizarre, and so full of fraud, desperation, and political warfare that it changes the way you think about the little piece of paper sitting in your pocket right now. So let me take you back not to 1929, but much further. Back to a time when the dollar wasn't even American, back to a time when money in this country was a complete and total mess. Long before there was a United States of America, there was a currency problem. The 13 colonies that would one day form the nation were, for all practical purposes, cash-starved. England controlled the colonial economy with an iron grip, and one of the most effective tools of that control was monetary. The British Crown forbade the colonies from minting their own coins. Think about that for a second. Here were millions of people building farms, running businesses, trading goods, but they weren't allowed to create their own money. It was a deliberate strategy of economic dependence, and it worked beautifully for England at least. So, what did the colonists actually use? They used whatever they could get their hands on, and the most common form of money circulating through the colonies wasn't British at all, it was Spanish. The Spanish silver dollar, also known as the piece of 8, became the de facto currency of colonial America. These were large, heavy silver coins, roughly 38 millimeters in diameter, minted from the seemingly bottomless silver mines of Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia. Spain had been producing them since 1497. And because of their consistent weight and high silver purity, they became trusted around the world, from the trading posts of the East Indies to the docks of Philadelphia. The name piece of 8 comes from the fact that the coin was worth 8 smaller Spanish units, called reales. And here's a detail that most people don't know. When colonists needed to make change, they literally cut the coin into pieces, like slicing a pie. 2 of those pieces equal a quarter of the dollar, and that's exactly where the expression 2 bits comes from. Even today, when an older American says 2 bits, they're unknowingly referencing a Spanish silver coin from the 15th century. And this is where the very word dollar enters the story, because the colonists started calling the Spanish piece of 8 a dollar, borrowing from the German word Thor, which referred to a similar large silver coin from Central Europe. The American dollar, the very concept of it, was born from a Spanish coin and a German word. There was nothing uniquely American about it at all. Not yet. But Spanish coins weren't the only game in town. Colonists also used British pounds, French livres, Dutch guilders, and Portuguese real. Imagine walking into a general store in 1750 and trying to buy a sack of flour. The merchant behind the counter might be holding 5 different currencies from 5 different empires, each with a different weight of gold or silver, each worth a different amount, depending on which colony you were standing in. It was absolute chaos. And then there was the barter system. In places where coins were especially scarce, colonists traded directly in commodities. Tobacco served as legal tender in Virginia and Maryland. Beaver pelts functioned as money in the northern colonies. Rice was currency in South Carolina. In Massachusetts, wampum, strings of polished shell beads used by indigenous peoples, was briefly recognized as legal tender. You could literally pay your taxes with shells. This was not a functioning monetary system. This was improvisation on a continental scale. Some colonies tried to solve the problem by printing their own paper money. Massachusetts was the first, issuing bills of credit in 1690 to pay soldiers returning from a failed military expedition against French Canada. Other colonies followed, but these notes had no standardization. A note from New York was worth a different amount than one from Pennsylvania. Their value fluctuated wildly, and critically, there was no central authority backing them. They were promises on paper, and whether those promises were kept depended entirely on the colony that issued them. When Britain passed the Currency Acts of 1751 and 1764, they effectively banned the colonies from printing legal tender paper money altogether, which only deepened the monetary crisis, and not coincidentally deepened colonial resentment toward the crown. And then the Revolution came, and with it came the first real attempt at a national American currency, one that would end in spectacular disaster. In 1775, the Continental Congress faced a staggering problem. They were fighting a war against the most powerful empire on earth, and they had no money to pay for it. The new Congress had no power to tax the colonies. There was no national treasury. There was no central bank. There was barely a functioning government at all, and yet they needed to feed, clothe, and arm an entire army. Their solution was to print money. Beginning in June of 1775, the Continental Congress authorized the issuance of paper notes called Continentals. These notes were denominated in Spanish mil dollars because the Spanish piece of 8 was still the most trusted unit of currency on the continent. Over the next 4 years, Congress ordered 11 separate emissions of continental currency, totaling roughly $242 million in face value. Now, here's where the theory met reality. These notes were not backed by gold. They were not backed by silver. They were backed by a vague promise that future tax revenues from the states would eventually redeem them. In other words, the revolutionary government was asking people to trust that a country that didn't yet exist would one day be wealthy enough to make good on these slips of paper. It was in a sense the first great American leap of faith, and at first it worked. Early Continentals circulated at or near the value of actual Spanish silver dollars. People accepted them, commerce moved, soldiers got paid, but the Congress kept printing and printing and printing. The more notes they issued, the less each one was worth. By 1779, it took roughly 40 continental dollars to buy what $1 in silver coin could purchase. By 1781, the ratio had collapsed to somewhere around 168 to 1. The notes became so worthless that soldiers reportedly wallpapered their barracks with them. The British made things even worse by flooding the colonies with expertly produced counterfeits. British agents in New York printed fake continentals by the thousands and distributed them through the countryside, deliberately accelerating the inflation that was already tearing the currency apart. It was economic warfare, and it was devastatingly effective. The phrase that was born from this catastrophe is still used today. Not worth a continental. When Americans say something is worthless, they're echoing the economic trauma of the Revolution, and the experience left such a deep scar on the national consciousness that for the next 80 years, there was an almost primal fear of paper money in American politics. The Founding Fathers were so scarred by the hyperinflation of the Continental that when they wrote the Constitution, they deliberately gave Congress the power to coin money, but said nothing about printing it. The Constitution also explicitly prohibited the states from issuing bills of credit. The message was clear. Paper money had nearly destroyed the Revolution. They were not going to let it happen again. So, what came next? If paper was out, then the new American Republic would build its monetary system on metal, and the man who designed that system was Alexander Hamilton. On April 2, 1792, President George Washington signed the Coinage Act into law. This was one of the most foundational pieces of legislation in American history, and yet most people have never heard of it. The act established the United States Mint in Philadelphia, created a decimal currency system, and for the first time defined the American dollar in precise terms of metal. One United States dollar was to contain 371 1/4 grains of pure silver, or approximately 24 grams. Hamilton arrived at this number by doing something remarkably practical. He ordered the Treasury to collect a random assortment of well-worn Spanish silver dollars, weigh them, and average the result. The American dollar was literally modeled on the Spanish piece of 8, calibrated to match the coin that Americans already trusted. The act also established gold coins. The eagle worth $10, the half eagle at 5, and the quarter eagle at 2 and A2. It set up a biometallic standard fixing the ratio of gold to silver at 15 to 1. And it carried a penalty for debasing the currency that feels almost medieval by today's standards. Any officer of the mint convicted of fraud or embezzlement would face the death penalty. That's how seriously the founders took the integrity of their money. But here's the thing about coins. They were beautiful. They were trustworthy. They were backed by actual precious metal, and they were completely impractical for a growing economy. Coins are heavy. They're hard to transport in bulk. You can't send a barrel of silver dollars across the Appalachian Mountains on horseback and expect it to arrive intact. And perhaps most critically, there was never enough gold and silver in the country to meet the demands of commerce. America was expanding westward at a breathtaking pace, and the supply of coined money simply couldn't keep up with the demand. So even though the federal government refused to issue paper currency, that didn't mean paper money disappeared from American life. Far from it. In fact, the period from roughly 1837 to 1863 was one of the most extraordinary and chaotic chapters in the history of money anywhere in the world. Historians call it the free banking era, and if you could travel back in time to witness it, you would think you'd stepped into some kind of financial fever dream. During this period, there was no national paper currency. Instead, individual state-chartered banks were allowed to print their own banknotes. And they did. Thousands of them. By the 1850s, there were an estimated 8,000 different kinds of paper money circulating in the United States, printed by roughly 1,600 state banks. each with their own design, their own denomination, and their own level of trustworthiness. A $5 note from a reputable bank in New York might be accepted at face value, but a $5 note from a small bank in rural Michigan, a merchant in Philadelphia, might only accept it at a steep discount, maybe $3, maybe $2, or maybe not at all. And this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a breeding ground for fraud on a scale that's hard to comprehend. Counterfeiting was absolutely epidemic. With so many different note designs in circulation, it was nearly impossible for an ordinary shopkeeper to know which bills were real and which were fake. Entire periodicals were published, thick booklets called counterfeit detectors and banknote reporters that attempted to catalog every legitimate banknote in the country, alongside descriptions and illustrations of known counterfeits. Merchants would keep these guides behind the counter and consult them every time someone handed over an unfamiliar bill. It was like trying to verify a passport in a world where every town issued its own. And then there were the wildcat banks. These were institutions that existed almost exclusively to issue worthless paper and then disappear. The name allegedly came from the practice of setting up a bank in a location so remote, so deep in the wilderness where the wildcats roamed, that anyone who tried to redeem their notes for gold or silver coins would find it virtually impossible to reach the bank. By the time they got there, the bank would be gone, its owners vanished, and the notes would be nothing more than decorated paper. Some wildcat banks kept almost no reserves at all. They would print thousands of dollars in notes, loan them out, and when depositors or note holders came knocking, the tills were empty. President Andrew Jackson tried to rein in the chaos. In 1836, he issued the Species Circular, which ordered that federal land could only be purchased with gold or silver coin, not paper banknotes. The idea was to force banks to prove they actually had the precious metal to back their promises. But the sudden demand for hard currency triggered a panic. People rushed to convert their banknotes to coin, discovered that many banks couldn't pay, and a cascade of failures swept the country. The Panic of 1837 devastated the economy. Banks collapsed by the hundreds, and the fundamental question at the heart of American finance, what is money and who gets to create it, remained violently unresolved. It took a civil war to finally answer it. When the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in April of 1861, the Union government faced the same problem that the Continental Congress had faced 86 years earlier. They needed to fight a war, and they didn't have the money to pay for it. The federal treasury was nearly empty, gold and silver reserves were dangerously low, and the cost of fielding an army of hundreds of thousands of men was climbing by the day. The initial response was cautious. In July of 1861, Congress authorized the Treasury to print $60 million in demand notes, issued in denominations of $5, $10, and $20. These were the first pieces of paper currency issued directly by the United States federal government since the ill-fated Continentals of the Revolution. And they were printed with green ink on the back, which is why people immediately started calling them greenbacks, a nickname that would outlast the notes themselves and eventually become a slang term for American money that's still used today. Now, these demand notes were actually quite solid. They could be exchanged for gold or silver coin on demand at the Treasury, which gave them real credibility. But the problem was scale. The war was burning through money faster than the government could print it. People were rushing to redeem their demand notes for gold, draining the Federal Reserves at an alarming rate. By December of 1861, the government had to suspend gold redemption entirely. The promise printed on each note that you could exchange it for precious metal was no longer being honored. So Congress took a dramatic step. On February 25, 1862, they passed the Legal Tender Act, which authorized the issuance of a new kind of paper currency called United States notes. These were different from demand notes in one critical way. They were not redeemable for gold or silver. They were fiat currency backed by nothing more than the credit and authority of the federal government. For the first time since the disastrous Continental, the United States was printing money that had no metal behind it, and Congress printed a lot of it. By the end of the war, roughly $450 million in greenbacks and related notes had been pumped into the economy. The bills came in denominations ranging from $1 all the way up to $10,000. And they looked nothing like the bills you carry today. They were large, nearly 7 and 12 in wide and over 3 in tall, about 30% bigger than a modern bill. They were crowded with elaborate engravings, intricate borders, and dense text. The designs were different for each denomination, each type, and each series. They were in their own way works of art, but they were also deeply confusing. And here's a detail that surprises most people. The very first $1 bill ever issued by the United States, printed in 1862, did not feature George Washington. It featured Salmon P. Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury under Abraham Lincoln. Chase was the man who oversaw the creation of the national currency, and he made the rather self-serving decision to put his own face on the inaugural dollar. It wasn't until 1869 that Washington's portrait replaced Chase's on the $1 note, but the greenbacks were only one kind of money circulating during and after the Civil War. This is where the story gets really complicated, because the federal government didn't just issue one type of paper currency. It issued several all at the same time, all in different colors with different legal properties and different backing. First, there were the United States notes, the greenbacks, with their distinctive red treasury seals. Then in 1863, Lincoln signed the National Currency Act, which created a new national banking system. Under this system, federally chartered banks were authorized to issue their own notes called national banknotes, backed by United States government bonds that the banks had to purchase and deposit with the Treasury. This served a dual purpose. It created a more uniform and trustworthy paper currency, while simultaneously forcing banks to buy government bonds, which helped finance the war. Over 12,000 national banks eventually participated in the system, each issuing notes that bore the name of the individual bank, alongside standardized federal designs. So you might have a $5 note from the First National Bank of Cleveland that looked similar to, but not identical to, a $5 note from the National Bank of Chicago. A 10% tax was levied on state banknotes, which effectively killed off the old wildcat system and forced most state banks to either convert to national charters or stop issuing paper money. Then came silver certificates beginning in 1878. These were backed by actual silver dollars held in the Treasury, and they were introduced as part of the ongoing political battle between silverites, who wanted more money in circulation, and gold bugs, who wanted to restrict the money supply to gold-backed currency. Silver certificates came in denominations from $1 all the way up to $1,000, and they featured blue Treasury seals. And then in 1882, gold certificates entered the picture. These were backed by gold coin or gold bullion, deposited with the Treasury, and they featured orange or gold-colored seals. They circulated primarily among banks and wealthy individuals making large transactions. So imagine yourself as an ordinary American in, say, 1890. You reach into your pocket, and you might pull out a greenback United States note with a red seal, or a national banknote from your local bank, or a silver certificate with a blue seal, or gold certificate with an orange seal. Each note looked different. Each had different legal backing. Each had a different relationship to precious metal. They were all technically dollars, but they were not the same kind of dollar. Keeping track of what your money actually meant required a level of financial literacy that would challenge most people today. And the bills themselves were enormous. All of these notes, regardless of type, were printed in what's now called the large size format. They measured roughly 7 3/8 in by 3 1/8 inch. Compare that to a modern bill, which is 6.14 inches x 2.61 inches. These old notes were significantly wider, taller, and more cumbersome. They didn't fold neatly into a modern wallet because the modern wallet hadn't been designed yet. People carried their money in large leather billfolds, coat pockets, or metal money clips. The designs were lavish by today's standards: elaborate engraved borders, allegorical figures, detailed vignettes of historical scenes, depictions of Native Americans, mythological characters, industrial imagery, eagles, ships, all rendered in the meticulous hand-engraved style of the era. Some of these notes are considered masterpieces of graphic art. The 1896 educational series of silver certificates is particularly famous. The $1 note featured a female figure representing history, instructing a young boy set against a backdrop of the Washington Monument in the Capitol Dome. These were not the austere, utilitarian notes we carry now. They were detailed, ornate, and visually stunning. But beauty came at a cost. These large notes were expensive to print. They used more paper, more ink, and required larger printing presses. And as the 20th century dawned, the sheer variety of currency types in circulation was becoming a logistical nightmare. The federal government was simultaneously maintaining greenbacks, national banknotes, silver certificates, gold certificates, and after 1914, a brand new type of currency that would eventually consume all the others: Federal Reserve notes. Now, the cracks in this system became painfully obvious during the Panic of 1907, when a failed attempt to corner the stock of United Copper Company triggered a cascade of bank runs across New York City. The entire financial system nearly collapsed. There was no central bank to inject liquidity, no institution with the authority to stop the bleeding. The crisis was ultimately resolved by one man, J.P. Morgan, who personally summoned the leading bankers of New York to his private library and essentially forced them to pull their resources and backs, stop the failing banks. A single private citizen had to save the American financial system because the government didn't have the tools to do it. It was humiliating, and it was terrifying, and it made the case for a central bank impossible to ignore. 6 years of debate, political maneuvering, and intense lobbying followed. The Money Trust investigation of 1912, led by the Pujo Committee in Congress, revealed the shocking degree to which a small cabal of bankers controlled the nation's credit and money supply. The findings electrified the public and gave reformers the political ammunition they needed. On December 23, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. This was the moment that truly redefined American money. The act created the Federal Reserve System, a network of 12 regional reserve banks overseen by a central board in Washington. And critically, it authorized the issuance of Federal Reserve notes, a new form of paper currency that would eventually become the only type of money the government printed. The first Federal Reserve notes entered circulation in 1914, in denominations from $5 to $100. At first, they were just one more variety of paper money in a system that was already overflowing with different kinds. But they had one crucial advantage. The Federal Reserve could expand or contract the supply of these notes to match the needs of the economy. This was the elastic currency that reformers had been demanding for decades. No more seasonal panics when farmers needed cash at harvest time and there wasn't enough to go around. No more banking crises triggered by a rigid, inflexible money supply. The Federal Reserve could, in theory, smooth out the booms and busts that had plagued American finance since the beginning. But even with this new system in place, the physical appearance of American money remained stuck in the 19th century. Large notes in multiple varieties, all circulating simultaneously, all different sizes, all different colors, all slightly different designs. It was efficient enough for a nation of 70 million people. But by the late 1920s, America had grown to over 120 million. The cost of producing all that oversized currency was staggering. And so we arrive at 1929, the year everything changed. On July 10, 1929, the United States government began issuing a completely redesigned series of paper currency. Every denomination, every type, was shrunk to a uniform size, approximately 6.14 in x 2.61 in. That's about 30% smaller than the old largest size notes. For the first time in American history, all paper money was the same dimensions regardless of denomination. A $1 bill was the same size as a $100 bill. A silver certificate was the same size as a Federal Reserve note. This was the birth of the modern dollar bill as we know it. The decision to shrink the currency was driven primarily by economics. The Treasury estimated that the smaller notes would save roughly $800,000 a year in paper and ink costs alone. But the redesign was about more than just saving money. It was about standardization. For the first time, each denomination was assigned a permanent portrait. Washington on the 1, Jefferson on the 2, Lincoln on the 5, Hamilton on the 10, Jackson on the 20, Grant on the 50, Franklin on the 100. These are the same faces that stare back at you today, nearly a century later. The backs of the notes were redesigned too, though it took a few more years for the final versions to appear. The first small-size $1 silver certificates issued in 1928 featured an oddly plain reverse, with a large printed one in a simple green border. People thought they looked so strange that they were nicknamed funny packs. It wasn't until 1935 that President Franklin Roosevelt and his Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace commissioned a reverse design featuring the Great Seal of the United States. The design, with the pyramid and the all-seeing eye on one side and the bald eagle on the other, that remains on the dollar bill to this day. And there's a fascinating story behind that pyramid design. Wallace had been reading a book about the Great Seal and was struck by the Latin phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum, meaning a new order of the ages. He brought the idea to Roosevelt, suggesting that the unfinished pyramid with the Eye of Providence above it would be a powerful symbol for a nation rebuilding itself during the Great Depression. Roosevelt agreed, and the design went to print. It's one of the most analyzed and speculated about images in American culture, inspiring conspiracy theories and secret society lore for decades. But its origin was remarkably practical, two government officials flipping through a book and deciding they liked the look of it. Now, stepping back from the details for a moment, let's consider what this entire journey actually reveals. For over 150 years, the United States, the nation that would eventually become the world's dominant economic power, could not figure out what its money should look like. From Spanish coins cut into pieces with knives, to worthless Continental script, to thousands of competing private banknotes, to oversized greenbacks issued in a civil war, to a confusing jumble of gold-backed, silver-backed, and government-backed paper, all circulating at once. The story of the American dollar is a story of constant improvisation, political compromise, and periodic catastrophe. And each phase of that story reflects something deeper about the country itself. The colonial reliance on foreign coins speaks to the reality of imperial dependence. The continental currency disaster reveals the fragility of revolutionary ambitions when they're not backed by economic power. The free banking era's chaos mirrors a nation that was expanding faster than its institutions could keep up. A country so committed to decentralization and individual liberty that it couldn't even agree on what counted as money. The Civil War greenbacks represent the moment when the federal government finally asserted its authority over the national economy, using the crisis of war to do what it couldn't do in peacetime. And the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, followed by the currency redesign of 1929, marks the culmination of a century-long struggle to build a monetary system worthy of a global superpower. But there's another thread running through this story, and it's one that matters enormously to the present day. Every major change in American currency was driven not by rational planning, but by crisis. The Continental was born from the desperation of revolution. The greenback was born from the desperation of civil war. The Federal Reserve was born from the panic of 1907 when the entire banking system nearly collapsed and had to be rescued by a single private citizen, J.P. Morgan, because there was no central bank to act as a lender of last resort. And the 1929 redesign arrived just months before the stock market crash that triggered the Great Depression, a crisis that would transform the dollar yet again when Roosevelt took the country off the gold standard in 1933. Over and over the pattern repeats. The system works until it doesn't. Then the crisis forces a change, and then the new system works until it doesn't either. It raises a question that feels especially relevant right now in a world where the dollar's dominance is being challenged by digital currencies, by the rise of the Chinese yuan, by talk of de-dollarization among the Bari CS nations. If the history of the dollar teaches us anything, it's that the money we use is never as permanent as it feels. Every generation assumes their currency is the natural order of things. The colonists trusted Spanish silver, the revolutionaries trusted continentals, the Victorians trusted gold. The 20th century trusted the Federal Reserve, and each of those systems at some point came undone. The dollar bill sitting in your wallet right now, that little green rectangle with George Washington's unsmiling face, is not a timeless artifact. It's a snapshot of a specific moment in a very long and very messy story. It carries within it the echoes of Spanish mines, of revolutionary printing presses, of wildcat banks and Civil War battlefields, of political backroom deals and financial panics. It is, in a very real sense, the product of over 500 years of trial, error, fraud, genius, and compromise. And the next time you pull one out to buy a coffee, maybe take a second to look at it. Really look at it, because that simple piece of paper is anything but simple. It is one of the most extraordinary inventions in human history, and the fact that we take it for granted is perhaps the most remarkable thing about it of all. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I've got a lot more stories like this coming, and you won't want to miss them. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next.